Let's bring in Evan Solomon. He is a CTV News political contributor and G0 Media publisher. Evan, as always, thanks for joining us.
Roger, first of all, great to see you, and condolences to the Mulroney family, a national family. We know that there's going to be a state funeral now, we've just heard. And Brian Mulroney's death hits everyone hard. I think, Raj, the tributes that you see from everybody who's had an opportunity to connect with him shows that Brian Mulroney was big personality, big on policy. So you got to separate the personal and the political. For most people, not with Brian Mulroney. His politics were very much personally, worked the phone. He had this gregarious, charismatic personality. I mean, he worked the phone the way, you know, a concert violinist works the first violin. He was on it before the internet. And he was a consummate politician, and he had a big heart, and he had big vision, and he made big consequential policy decisions. And by his own admission, he made big mistakes. Why? Everything about Brian Mulroney was big.
With his successes, do you think part of them came because of his ability to work with both sides of the floor, both sides of the aisle? I mean, you hear these tributes pouring in from everybody from Bob Ray, all of them saying how much they admired him.
So look, if everyone wants to do themselves an incredible favor, read Brian Mulroney's memoirs. Look, this is a guy that came out of nowhere. You know, even though you look at him now. Right. I mean, this is a guy, you know, with his beautiful suits and his baritone voice. And, you know, he's been at the pinnacle of power now for so long. You forget that he was a working class guy from Baie-Comeau who worked his way up, became a lawyer. You forget that when he ran for the conservative leadership in 1976 and he lost to Joe Clark, in his memoirs, he said he was so devastated that he turned to alcohol, and it was so damaging to him. And he was so depressed and self-recriminating that it wasn't until, very famously, and he wrote about it in 1980, he said, "That's it, I'll never have another drink again." And he never did, by the way. But he was candid about that. He was emotional. And then when he finally ascends to power, and he finally, he comes out of nowhere. He'd never governed before, takes over the party, wins the leadership, and finally has that massive majority win. People had been sick of the Pierre Trudeau era, and in comes finally Brian Mulroney with the biggest majority in Canadian history. And he ascends to power, and he stays there almost a decade. And that Mulroney era is characterized by massive triumphs, the free trade deal, some huge progress on the green front, the acid rain treaty, the massive foreign policy, visionary stuff in South Africa, huge domestic battles over Quebec and the Meech Lake and Charlottetown, and the grand failures to strike a national bargain to kind of finally bring Quebec into the fold. And then, of course, there were scandals. So, this is a 4-act Shakespearean play, but the last act is an act, what you said, Raj, where he becomes beloved. He becomes the consigliere to everybody, the advisor and the friend to conservatives, liberals, NDP alike. And that's the Brian Mulroney that people are celebrating today, the friend and advisor to all.
Now, you had a chance, you've interviewed him numerous times. What most impressed you when you sat down with him?
Yeah, I had the great opportunity, like so many people, to be in contact with him, both personally and professionally. Again, that's how Brian Mulroney worked. If you wanted a professional relationship, you had to talk to him on the phone. By the way, Roger, there was no phone call you liked more. I mean, I mean, the two guys, Mr. Chrétien and Mr. Mulroney, are just grand raconteurs, both of them. Brian Mulroney always asked, very curious, asked after my wife. How's that Irish wife of yours? Love that. So he knew things, right? That was his mark. The details. And he did that with journalists and politicians and citizens all the time. That's what made him, in some sense, the Wayne Gretzky of politics, as a pure politician. So I would speak to him. In fact, Raj, on my last show hosting CTV's Question Period, I invited Mr. Mulroney on, and he was a guest. And of course, I wanted to talk to him about China and conservative politics and all sorts of things. And he began with a tribute to my time, which, very typical Brian Mulroney, generous to a fault. But the key thing is he never stayed there. He used that as a bridge to talk about policy. And he loved talking about policy. I would say more than anyone, he loved being in the game. There was a while where he was out of the game, after the Karl-Heinz Schreiber stuff. But he had a short memory for slights and a long memory for friendships. And those friendships got him back in the game. And no one loved being in the game more than Brian Mulroney. No one was better at it. And he made a difference. And so he talked about China. And I asked him two things. What are the biggest challenges to the world right now? This was last year or a year and a bit ago. And without hesitating, Roger, he said, China is the biggest challenge and climate. Those, he said, were the two biggest challenges facing. Then he said Canadian productivity and unity.
And he's pretty accurate on all of those, I'd say, right now.
He always was. I mean, isn't that incredible? Here's a guy who, and he had some health challenges in the last years, but his kids were very active in a very public life, but he loved engaging. And, a true love of politics is not about burnishing your past, but being engaged in the future. And one thing I always liked about Mr. Mulroney, I admired about him, outside of the fact that he could charm the stripe off a skunk. I mean, that guy was unbelievably charming, right? I mean, he was gregarious and charming, was that he was intelligent. And every time you spoke to him, you could put something in your pocket and take it away and use it as a tool to help you understand something, because he was so connected. And there was a purpose to his connection. It wasn't about gossip. It wasn't about, please talk more about me. It was so he could learn something and try to continually steer this country in a direction that he felt right. He had a lot of opponents. And let's not forget, he had big fights, huge fights. He was a battler and he made enemies. Sorry, let me correct that. He made opponents.
Yes,
not enemies.
I think that's what it sounds like.
He made opponents, not enemies. I think that's a really important distinction. Despite the fact that you can pull tape and people were furious at him about the GST, for goodness sake, they became his opponents, not his enemies. And you're seeing today his opponents say, I really admired him. I really liked him, because he being Brian Mulroney's opponent made you better at your game. That's the way politicians felt. And that's very different than an enemy. And he didn't have those.
I think that's a good note to leave it on, Evan. We're out of time right now.